الصهيونية المسيحية، ما الأسباب الحقيقية التي أدت إلى ازدهار هذه الحركة؟ وما العلاقة التي تربط إسرائيل باليمين المسيحي في الولايات المتحدة؟ وما الدور الذي تلعبه هذه الحركة في الصراعات الحالية الدائرة حول العالم وخاصة في الشرق الأوسط؟ الصهيونية المسيحية والدوافع السياسية من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا.
All of our differences disappear and we truly become Christians united in behalf of Israel.
في القرن العشرين انتقلت الصهيونية المسيحية إلى الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، ولا سيما بعد إنشاء إسرائيل. على الرغم من أن جذورها تعود إلى قرون كثيرة مضت، فهي تسبق ظهور الحركة الصهيونية بمئات السنين. الصهيونيون المسيحيون الأمريكيون استخدموا وسائل الإعلام بشكل لا نظير له في نشر أفكارهم وأوهامهم وأحلامهم ومعتقداتهم، وشكل تيارهم في الولايات المتحدة على الدوام دعامة استندت إليها الصهيونية في تحقيق مشروعها وفي تشكيل مجموعات ضغط تعمل لمصلحة إسرائيل. هم يؤمنون بأنه سيكون لمدينة القدس في المستقبل غير البعيد دور بارز للغاية في الطريقة التي سينتهي بها العالم. فما طبيعة العلاقة والمصلحة التي تربط إسرائيل باليمين المسيحي في الولايات المتحدة وأين يلتقيان؟ وكيف يفسر هؤلاء المسيحيون الكتاب المقدس؟ لماذا تملك إسرائيل الضوء الأخضر لتوسيع مستوطناتها وبناء الجدار وقضم الأراضي وتهجير الفلسطينيين؟ ولماذا يعتبر أي انتقاد لإسرائيل من قبل أي عضو في الكونغرس الأمريكي انتحاراً سياسياً؟ ما مصير الأديان الأخرى في القدس المحتلة وفي أراضي عام 48 بعد الوعود الأمريكية المتكررة حول الهوية اليهودية لإسرائيل؟ ولماذا يغادر المسيحيون هذه المنطقة؟ ما الدور الذي تلعبه الصهيونية المسيحية في كل ذلك وفي الصراعات الحالية الدائرة حول العالم وخاصة في الشرق الأوسط؟ المضامين السياسية للصهيونية المسيحية والسعي للسيطرة على مصير العالم الحديث يكشفها لنا رئيس جمعية الكتاب المقدس العالمية في المملكة المتحدة الأستاذ ستيفان سايزر، مؤلف كتاب الجنود المسيحيون لصهيون. Dr. Stephen Sizer, welcome again to our show. Now, in continuation to what we discussed in the previous show about the theological and the historical background of Christian Zionism, tonight we need to focus a bit on the political implications and the agenda of this movement. I want to know, as you said, that its prime focus is of the Christian Zionists is in the US of A. What role does the current US administration play in relation to Christian Zionism or vice versa?
Christian Zionism is the dominant religious opinion in American society today. Therefore, it's not surprising that it has influence among US politicians.
Just and the US administration in particular?
Yes. I mean, in the 19th century, British strategic interest in the Middle East was energized and encouraged by the Christian view that Britain had a role in furthering God's will for the Jewish people. So in the 21st century, we see the same attitude in America. If you ask most American Christians what is their view of Israel, they would say Israel is God's chosen people, He's brought them back to the land, and therefore it's a privilege and honor to be supporting what God is doing today. And the very fact that the Christians are a majority in America, and their opinions matter to politicians, that alongside the Israel lobby's funding of American politicians means that basically Israel gets its way. You will not find a single serving US politician critical of Israel because it's political suicide.
Does it have a specific, let's say, political influence inside the US administration? And if so, where is the prime focus?
But it's very hard to tell, other than in the memoirs of former presidents when they talk about
Leave
the
office,
influence.
yes.
Yes. And it's interesting that in George W. Bush's biography that's come out recently, he talks in terms of the neocons and their influence on him. It's clearly the people around the political leaders who have the most influence, who can put pressure on them, influence them in their foreign policy thinking. So it's very hard today to say who is having influence. We simply know that leading Christian theologians, people like Pat Robertson, John Hagee and others are having a profound influence because of their access to US politicians, their media influence through television and radio.
Is it only the media influence and the religious leaders' influence on the administration, or we do have some people inside the administration, political figures, let's say, who are affiliated, let's say, or are influenced by this movement?
Yes, again,
or who operate according to what this movement says?
That's much harder to assess because if I think about your question, Christian Zionism as a movement is very broad. It reflects a wide range of opinion on Israel and on the land and on Jerusalem and so on, and therefore it's hard to tie down who's influencing whom. But at a simple level, US politicians depend heavily on the Israel lobby for their funding, their campaign funding, and so every 4 years they all become very pro-Israel.
AIPAC especially.
AIPAC, for example.
Yes.
But the weapons industry is probably 6 or 7 times more generous than the Israel lobby. So the US armaments business has a strong influence on US politicians, and presumably Israeli firms do as well. Mm-hmm. Clearly every 4 years they're all eager to please Israel because that is going to guarantee their succession politically. But at a popular level, the rhetoric of Christian Zionist leaders, their books, their teaching, at a subliminal level, clearly is creating a climate where it would be anathema for the US president to challenge Israel publicly, mm-hmm. because he would realize he is stirring up a hornet's nest. There is no effective opposition to the Israel lobby in the United States, and that's unhealthy for America.
But why do you think, for example, Barack Obama has never visited Israel yet during his tenure?
Well, perhaps politically he's never needed to, but perhaps he will. He doesn't tend to advertise his itinerary until he's there, or very close to when he's there, for security reasons. Hillary Clinton made a visit to Jerusalem in order to secure her senatorship in New York, so it wouldn't surprise me that if Barack Obama sees his ratings dip, that he would make a visit to Jerusalem in order to raise his ratings.
Dr. Seizer, is it true what they believe in, that there is a prophecy that says that if you believe in the Bible or the scripture, it's synonymous to siding with Israel, because if Israel collapses, then they will collapse and vanish? How far is that true?
There's a prophecy in Genesis where God says to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And many Christian Zionists take that promise, which was said to Abraham and Abraham alone, and apply it to today, that if countries, America or Britain or wherever, supports Israel, God will bless them. And if the United States ceases to support Israel, in some way God will punish the United States. This is entirely fallacious. It's not founded in the Bible. It's a misreading of the Bible, but it's a popularly held myth.
Mm-hmm. So what are the real backstage reasons behind this movement, and who is adopting and endorsing it in the meantime?
There are many Christian leaders who've become wealthy and prosperous and influential because they support the Israel lobby. And you will find there is a theology particularly prevalent in America that says that God is blessing you individually, your family, your community, because you support Israel. And so you will find Israeli flags alongside the US flag inside churches, for example, to show their support and solidarity for God's chosen people. So self-interest is a powerful motivation. If I want to be wealthy, I want to be prosperous, and I believe that it has to do with Israel, then I will support Israel uncritically because I want to be wealthy.
Is there a specific church that follows this?
There are many, many churches. You know, the Pentecostal churches, the television evangelist Benny Hinn, Rodney Howard-Brown, Morris Cerullo. There are many what we call television evangelists. They're pastors whose ministry is through the television rather than through a local building, who encourage people to give them money in the belief that God will bless them in return. And they use Israel as a means of receiving that money. Bless Israel through our ministry, and the way that they do that is through assisting Jewish people to return to the land from Russia, for example, or funding the settlements. You will find churches in the United States that are funding the illegal Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territories, or seeking to rebuild the Jewish temple, for example.
Can we elaborate more on the backstage reasons?
Yes, the theology of Christian Zionism believes that the Jews are God's chosen people. God gave them all the Middle East. Jerusalem is their capital. The temple is going to be rebuilt, and there will be a war of Armageddon, a conflict at the end of time between the believers in God and those who reject Him. Now, each of those has a political dimension. If you believe the Jews are God's chosen people, you must support Israel politically, financially, and many Christians do that. If you believe they've been given the land, then the settlements are very important. And so, sadly, Christian churches supporting quite racist settlers in the belief that they are God's chosen people. Jerusalem, the belief that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel is held by Christian Zionists and Israel, but no one else recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. There are no embassies in Jerusalem. Tel Aviv is seen as the international capital of Israel. But Christian Zionists are lobbying the US administration to move the embassy.
To move the embassy to
If they move the embassy,
Jerusalem.
we all have to recognize what the Americans have done. De facto, Jerusalem becomes the exclusive, undivided capital of Israel. And the temple, the belief that the Jews will come back to the land and worship God through the temple, means that you'll find Christian churches, sadly, funding the destruction of the Dome of the Rock and rebuilding of the Jewish temple. It sounds crazy, but within their very literalistic reading of the Bible, it makes sense to them. And not surprisingly, their view of the future is very pessimistic, and their theology is very confrontational. And that means that they're deeply suspicious of the peace process, deeply prejudiced toward Arabs and Muslims, sadly. And therefore, our agenda, our priority is to deconstruct this theology and challenge it at its core base.
Do you think that there would be, let's say, U.S. administration that is going to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem?
Well, the legislation has been passed by Congress on 3 occasions under 3 previous presidents, and the funding's been allocated, the location for the new embassy's been identified, but 3 successive presidents, Clinton, Bush and Obama, have all refused to sign off on the legislation. They realize that it will be detrimental to American interests to do it. But the Israel lobby is pushing because they don't want to share Jerusalem with the Palestinians. They don't want a divided city, and they do not want a Palestinian state. And they will do anything and everything they can to undermine that.
Now, do you think that there is a kind of linkage or a connection between the politicians in the US and the politicians in Israel?
Well, there is a marriage of convenience, certainly. If I was an Israeli politician...
And what sort of interest link
Yes.
both?
I mean, if I was an Israeli politician and on the other side of the world was a very wealthy, prosperous country, the only superpower in the world, that believed that we were chosen, we were special.
Do you believe that the US is the only superpower in the world nowadays?
Well,
After this massive economic crisis?
Israel spends more money... Sorry. The United States spends more money on its military industry than every other country in the world combined, which suggests that Israel and America combined are the world's superpower. So what America wants to do, it tends to get away with it. And sadly, with a Christian Zionist theological framework for much of what America sees of the rest of the world. Their policy in the Middle East, although they talk about the two states, wanting peace, recognizing the state of Palestine, the fact that they vetoed a Palestinian state in the United Nations reveals that Israel and America is really not interested.
Yes. We will continue talking about the political implications of a Christian Zionism, but after a short break. Short break, and we'll be back. Stay tuned. Welcome back, Dr. Seizer. Now, as far as we know, that until the late, let's say in the 50s, there was not so much importance given to Israel by the U.S. administration. But later on, we've seen that much of support and interest was given by the successive U.S. administrations to Israel. How can you explain the soaring of political importance given to Israel, and what made this leverage?
Well, a number of factors, a number of influences came together in the 60s, the 1960s. You find Jimmy Carter is the first explicitly Christian president in the United States in 1976. 1977, Menachem Begin is elected as the Israeli Prime Minister, and you find a relationship develops between the evangelical right in America and the Israeli right, and Jerry Falwell becomes the broker, the marriage partner that brings the two together, and they recognize that they have things in common. They believe in the Bible, they believe that Israel is in some sense linked to its history, and it's very important for Christians to support what God is doing. Before the 60s particularly, American attitudes to Israel were much more ambivalent. Toward the end
it didn't rotate around all their politics around the guardianship and the protection of Israel before.
Things were very different before the 60s. Many of the, if not all of the US ambassadors in the Middle East in the 40s and 50s were men and women who had been raised in the Arab world. They were the sons of missionaries in the Middle East. They loved the Arab people, they spoke Arabic, and they recognized that US support for Israel would undermine American interests in the Middle East. Many of the Arab ambassadors serving in the United Nations in 1948 had gone to American universities in Cairo, in Beirut and other cities, and therefore there was a much closer relationship between the Arab world and American interests prior to the 60s. America was mired in the Vietnam War in the 60s, and it saw Israel's victory in 6 days over the Arab world as somehow a miracle. And it's reported that Moshe Dayan was invited to the White House to advise the American administration on how to win the Vietnam War. So Israel's image soared after '67, and Kissinger particularly did a hatchet job on the US administration's Foreign Service Corps, and you saw a definite shift that moved in favor of Israel as a result of Kissinger's influence, Nixon, and then Jimmy Carter in particular, when the Christian right found a cause that it could work with. Communism was over, and now the enemy was the Arab world.
Under such circumstances, and based on these ideas, what is the fate of other religions like Islam and Christianity in occupied Palestine?
It's very hard to predict the future. We work closely with Jewish groups, Muslim groups, and the Christian church in Israel-Palestine to further the peace process, to find a way forward that recognizes the legitimate rights of the Palestinians. We want to protect the Jewish people, but we also want to defend the rights of the Palestinians. So a way forward has to be found, and that must either be two states or one state. What we have at the moment is not acceptable. Israel is not a democracy. It's following an apartheid strategy of seeking to create a land of no people for a people with no land. They want the land, they don't want the Arabs on the land. So their strategy is to drive the Palestinians into the desert.
To transfer them, perhaps to
Transfer them
somewhere
in
else.
whatever way they can and take their land. That is unacceptable, and it is destabilizing the Middle East. So the alternative is 2 states or 1 state. 2 states recognizing the 67 borders, but if Israel won't give up the settlements, if it won't allow a viable, independent, contiguous, sovereign Palestinian state, what's the alternative? The alternative is 1 state, equal rights for all, Jews and Arabs, Jews and Palestinians, equal rights. But will Israel give up being a Jewish state? Probably not. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is civil disobedience, boycotts, divestment, sanctions. The Church is committed to non-violent ways of challenging the Israeli aggression, challenging Israeli apartheid, and furthering the cause of justice and peace. Security for Israelis, but justice for Palestinians. They're not necessarily contradictory. They can both be achieved. But it must either mean the giving up of the settlements, withdrawing to the 67 borders, or embracing the Palestinians, giving them the vote. The American Civil War was fought over the same issue. Was America going to have slavery or freedom? Treat the blacks as slaves or give them equal rights? Our hope and prayer is that it doesn't take another war to achieve equality and coexistence between Jews and Palestinians.
Right. Now, currently, what role is the Christian Zionism playing in the Middle East, particularly when it comes to whatever is taking place now, all these revolutions, upheavals? How is it related to them?
Most Christian Zionists are Democrats. They live in America, Europe, South America, and so on. And so we value our freedom and our democracy. So at one level, you see an empathy and a sympathy for the Arab Spring, the uprisings that we've seen in Egypt against totalitarian regimes. But most Christian Zionists don't necessarily appreciate that their governments have been funding the oppression of those people, because America has agreed with Israel to, if you like, buy the Egyptian regime, buy the Jordanian regime to placate Israel's traditional enemies. And on the other hand, suppress the freedom and rights of people in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, for example, or Iran. So they use the carrot and the stick. The carrot incentivizing leadership, Arab leadership, to comply with Israel's policies, and if they don't, then to use the stick and foment civil disobedience, strife, and conflict, as we see in Syria today.
Mm-hmm. Now, according to John Hagee of the Cornerstone Church, and he's an ardent, of course, Christian Zionist, he says, quote, "We favor a war with Iran to secure the second coming of the Christ, and millions of evangelical Christians want to start World War III to speed up the second coming." What are the specific goals of this movement in the near future, and what is their stance when it comes to a war against Iran?
Christian Zionism is born in a kind of a dualistic theology, a belief in white and black, good and evil, good people and bad people.
The same way it goes with George W. Bush, the
yes,
axis
so
of
the
evil.
axis of evil.
Yeah.
I mean, it is simplistic in the extreme to suggest that whole peoples, be they Iraqis or Iranians or Syrians, are somehow all sympathetic to their leadership or all agree in their opposition to America or Israel. Most Arabs in the Middle East that I meet just want to live in peace. They want to raise their children. They want a secure future. They do not want war. The tragedy is, for me, that many Christians in the West have this dualistic view of the world that's almost like a computer game. You know, you're playing a PlayStation game, good guys and the bad guys, the blood is only tomato ketchup, it's not real, you can turn it off and there's no real pain or suffering. In their theology, they believe that the church will go to heaven before this final battle of Armageddon, and therefore they're not worried, they're not fearful of the future, and therefore they can be detached emotionally from the suffering caused in the Middle East is compounded by the fact that most Western media give a very distorted view of what's happening in the Middle East. So if, for example, there are some deaths as a result of a drone attack in Afghanistan, we're told that those who were killed were terrorists, and somehow that means it's okay. We're not necessarily told that they're human beings. They had children, they had wives, that they were farmers, it was a wedding. So it's a clinically detached view of the Middle East, which we want to challenge as we inform the Western Christian community with what actually is happening on the ground.
Mm-hmm. How far is the American public aware of what lies beneath Christian Zionism?
They're becoming aware slowly. We produced a film recently with God on our side, showing the dangers of believing God is on my side against my enemies. A healthy influence, particularly among younger people in America, in the universities and colleges. And the books that we've been writing, helping them to read the Bible more accurately, more consistently, I believe is having an influence. We're seeing slow signs that the US media, CNN, for example, and other media, are beginning to report what is actually happening in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And so that Americans are better informed now, perhaps, than they were a generation earlier, but we've got a long way to go.
So this is your particular role when it comes to Christian Zionism. This is what you're doing in order to educate the people more, to let them be aware of the real dangers of this movement.
Yes, what we're seeking to do is keep Jesus central to our theology. As Christians, Jesus' teaching and his example should be our model for how we treat people. Jesus said, for example, such as you did to the least of these, you did to me. The way that we treat people is the way that we treat God, because they are created in his image. And if we go through life thinking, this is a person made in the image of God and I must treat them respectfully as if they were Jesus, it revolutionizes the way you treat people. You cannot treat people as lower than yourself or treat them disrespectfully. So our theology is Christocentric, and therefore our view of the Middle East conflict must be tempered or influenced by our mandate. The mandate for Christians is to be peacemakers. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. The scriptures, the Christian scriptures, teach us that we are ambassadors of reconciliation, not confrontation, not retaliation, not escalation, but reconciliation. Now, what does that mean? Well, an ambassador is someone who is living on foreign soil. It teaches me that this is not my home. I'm here temporarily on foreign soil to serve God and be his ambassador. So wherever I travel, my mandate is to seek peace, justice and reconciliation. So that's our message to the Christian community in the United States.
Excellent. Reverend Dr. Stephen Sizer, thanks a million for this interview. And also we have to remind our audience that you are the vicar of Christ Church, Virginia, Wooter, Surrey, where we are now. It's a lovely place. Thanks a million for this interview again. إذن لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل ودائما من الداخل. إلى اللقاء.